how you feel about market risk, in fact, has little to do with your personality. It's much more about what's going on with the market at the time. And at the time of us recording this podcast today, John, the market has been, how you say, a little wonky?
Wonky's an understatement. It's in full dumpster fire mode. Depending on the tweet at the time. I know. You just never know what's going to happen. No one knows who's going to be tariffed next, whatever. Yeah. But markets are they do what they do. We know they go up and down. It'd just be nice if they weren't all spoiled. Yeah, all of the whirly-doos and the upside downs of a roller coaster all in the same 23 feet. Right? It's nicer if you can space it out. Yeah. But when you do it all in about a 20 feet span, all that you're going to do after that is barf. I mean, let's just be straight up. I mean, which is kind of what the market's been doing recently.
Anyway, yeah, feel nauseous at least anyway. I'm Heather Branch. This is financial advisor John Hicks, founder of J. Hagan Capital, who is here to share with you some insight on how to better prepare for your financial future, thinking about your retirement years, what you need to be considering, particularly in times like these when we've seen such market turbulence. The economy is uncertain. We're seeing inflation rates go up, John. And there was this article on Kiplinger talking about how when it comes to our appetite for risk, it's not determined by our personality, but in fact, it's a reflection of what's going on in the market at the time. So, for example, if you're on a winning streak in Las Vegas, you're going to think and speak much more positively about the game. And that's kind of how we function on our perspective with the market. So what are the dangers in that thought process? And also, let's just break down what's been happening. And for those who are close to retirement or just retired, where they can control what you can control is what I always like to say. So where do they do that?
It was interesting. So before we got on the show today, we were talking about, albums that came out, during the 80s. And when we're talking about appetite for risk tolerance, it reminds me of appetite for destruction, which is what it feels like is going on with the markets right now, right? But anyone that's listened to this podcast in the past or anyone that's, heard me for the past 10 years, always understand markets go up and down. The one thing I've been citing since November of last year, even before the presidential election, was that we have been on a pretty good run. 2023, 2024 were very good years. And if you were looking at things, no one necessarily saw that things were going to fall apart. I don't think that anything was glaring and broadcasting signals of the market's going to go down. But I did say, hey, if you look at some of the really smart guys like Robert Shiller, who won the Nobel Prize back in the day, specifically for the research I'm about to cite, Shiller's research said that the market was around 42% more expensive than it should be. Now, does that mean the market's going to crash? Of course not. But what it did mean at those numbers, it meant that the market may only average about 1.6% over the next decade, only because it was just really expensive. And what has happened since roughly November? Of course, November, Trump wins. The people that wanted him to win shot the market up. Market was way up in November. But then December stunk. January's okay, but then February stunk. And here we are in March, and the Ides of March are all around us. It's kind of stinking. So when you kind of look at these things, did we know that things were going to go down? No. But I have some numbers in front of me right now, which is very interesting. If you now look at what the Atlanta Fed is saying, the Atlanta Federal Reserve Board is now saying that we may see a 2.5% contraction in GDP. Guys, this is not just a market downturn, potentially. This may be an actual recession. And even the president, who is very, very, very close to the vest when it comes to him saying bad news, he even said you can't rule out a recession. So those are things we have to really be careful of, especially if you're doing what we're talking about in the show, which is getting closer to retirement or you're already retired. So I want to talk about some of the precautions that we should be making and then some of the things that we should be doing because we can't control a recession. There's not a single thing that any one of us can do to stop a recession or stop a market downturn. We can, however, control our own personal finances, and that's what we have to do. So the three major things we all have to consider. Number one, if we're already retired or if we're about to retire. Number one, and first and foremost, you have to understand where your income's going to come from. So, do you have enough emergency reserves? I typically want my clients, the first 2 years of their original retirement, I want them to have about 2 years worth of income stacked up so they don't have to pull from potentially assets that have been hurt a little bit, right? So you have to make sure you have a good cushion. Now, I typically want emergency funds to be around 6 months, and that's not just me. I mean, you can go to bankrate.com, you can go to Fidelity, you can go to Schwab, Vanguard. They all say a similar thing, about 6 months worth of just straight up cash reserves for your emergency fund. But you want short-term instruments that are still earning something, right? Luckily, interest rates are still high, so we can still get 4 to 4.5, maybe even 5-ish% on safe liquid assets that we can keep that 1 to 2 years worth of income in, right? Because if you have that, you're not going to hopefully be forced to pull from those assets to create and provide you that income that you're going to need in retirement, okay? So those are the two big things you have to do. Number 3, you have to understand your risk tolerance, like we just talked about a minute ago. Everyone loves it when the market's going up, but man, everyone hates it if it does for a period of time what we're seeing it do right now, which is be very uncomfortable every time someone says tariff, every time someone says a different country that may not be happy with the United States right now, every time we talk about mass deportations and things like that, regardless of your political context. Those are things that the markets absolutely hate, because it can't figure out, well, how much money your company's going to make if all these people that have been buying our products were shipping out of the country, or how much money can these companies make if all of a sudden, interest rates keep going up or don't go down, and blah 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 blah. It doesn't understand what's going to happen next, and it doesn't like that. Uncertainty is bad, but we can be very cognizant and conscious of how we plan our portfolio as we get closer to retirement. I know that half of the gurus out there say you should have a 60-40 portfolio, 60% in the market or equity type things and 40% safer. I don't subscribe to that for everyone. I think you have to have the right amount of your money in a bucket so that you can't lose what you can't afford to lose. For instance, if you're 70 years old, in my opinion, you probably need close to 70% of your money safer. Why? Because you don't have enough time potentially to wait for the market to come back to give it back to you. And this isn't a new thing, right? So Heather, if we think about it, going back to the dot-com bust, the dot-com bust took 3 years to pop. 2000, 2001, 2002. It took 3 years to lose nearly 50% of your life savings if you were in the market. And here's the problem. It took all the way to 2007, so 7 years from the time it started to pop, to get back close to where you were. And then what happened in 2008? It popped again.
Yeah.
So I know I'm laughing. It's not funny at all, because if you were trying to retire during that period of time, great chance you weren't able to retire, or not able to retire the way you wanted to if you had too much of your money at risk. Long term, I am a huge proponent of equities. I'm a huge proponent of the United States doing good things. Things are weird right now. That doesn't mean that they won't equalize and get good, but I do not want anyone risking too much at the wrong time. So you have to get those risk parameters in place. If you have an appetite for risk tolerance, just make sure it's not an appetite for destruction, because that could very easily derail all of us. And I'm not talking about a scathing/solo. I'm talking about something much worse, which is what Axl Rose looks like now, today.
Yeah.
Let's just be straight up.
I saw Guns N' Roses a few years back.
It's not a good look on him. When he was, emaciated because he's on terrible drugs, and no one wants that, but he looked a lot better than whatever he's doing now.
Let's talk about the good people watching us or listening to this podcast right now, and hopefully them looking okay, despite the odds. You were talking about folks that are in their 60s or 70s. What about somebody who's 59, 60, 61, and was looking to retire either now or sometime in the next couple of years, and they're seeing this happen?
Yeah.
How do they need to approach, adjust, shift? What questions do they need to be asking of themselves if they're DIYers, or if they have an advisor, what do they ask their advisor?
Well, if you think about it, a few years ago, interest rates were zero. So if the market wasn't performing, you made nothing from being in bonds. You potentially even lost money in some bonds. You didn't make any money from the bank. Things have changed a little bit, right? So now you don't have to have all the risk in the world of being in the stock market to get a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% return. There are some things right now, and they're not perfect. In any individual product has its pros and cons, but there are some things now that can keep you pretty safe, or they're buffered. You can use buffered ETFs, which basically mean there's a safety net inside of these exchange traded funds, which are a lot like mutual funds. So you can protect your downside, but you still may have, Heather, 8, 9, 10% to the upside. Those aren't bad. You can do the same thing with banks. You can do the same thing with insurance companies. So when someone says, John, I understand, but I want to be in the market because it's the only way to make money, I would kind of agree with that if interest rates were still zero, but now they're kind of good. So you can do some things to lock in some parts of your principal where you can't lose very much. In some cases, you can't lose any, but you still may be able to get 7, 8, 9, 10% on your money. Guys, those are pretty good only because we haven't seen those since 1998. Some of these products didn't even exist back then,
right.
But you have to go all the way back to 1998 since we saw rates this high that may sustain. Now, we still have to factor in inflation. You still got to factor in your spending needs. Those are big deals. You need to probably talk or at least get a second opinion on income production from your portfolio from a fiduciary. But outside of that, I mean, just understand there are a lot of things out there. I'm not a gold bug. I'm not a crypto guy. But if you had had certain types of exposures to gold over the past 3 years, those are double-digit returns, and they work a little differently than the market. Crypto, I'm not a fan of, but there are some types of hedged or safer alternative assets out there that do quite well. Now, if you're a multimillionaire, you have access to hedge funds. Now, that's why many of these things exist. Hedge funds, by their very nature, were created by tens of millionaires and billionaires to hedge downside risk on their life savings. Because, hey, listen, they've already won. They've already made their tens of millions or hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. They just don't want to lose everything they got. So a lot of their types of strategies are hedged to the downside. No, it's not right for everyone, and some of us don't even have options to look at those things. But those are all things that we can consider in the current environment that don't just force us to go into the market and potentially get lambasted and potentially not be able to retire when we want. So protection is important, but you have to understand all the various things that you can invest in that may be more suited to your needs.
If you are wondering about what these options are for you specifically, John's going to meet with you in person. His team at J. Hagan Capital is here to do that. So find us at retirementsolutionshow.com. That's where to go to begin this conversation. The idea of checking those 3 boxes. Where does your income come from? Do you have an emergency fund? Do you have 2 years worth of income that's in a safe place? Do you have proper risk set up within your portfolio to tolerate the variance, the variability of the market that we have seen in the last days and that you're going to see? Listen, you're probably going to be retired for 20, 30, 40 years, hopefully. Let's make sure that your money is going to last you in that space as well. This is what John and his team working on every day in the office and can work on with and for you as well. Again, it's retirementsolutionshow.com or just click on the links we've got posted in the show notes.